I didn't know that how full a service the team provided here. I see I didn't even have to bring my own Bible today, but it's in the wrong passage, so I'm going to put it over here. I also was reminded as I was just listening about the best definition of a long weekend I ever heard. And that is 3 days of unseasonably low temperatures with light to heavy rain, followed by warming trends. And I think that about sums up our weekend so far. I don't know about you. But I know when we have been walking the dog, it's been unseasonably cold. Anyway, now that the media team, which has been pointed out, is doing a great job, and they get the levels of this mic working properly, Steve reminds me that he does have the power to shut it off. So if I get off track, don't be surprised if the audio shuts off. Okay? Now, also I was very, it's interesting how when I come to speak, I usually try not to interact with other people who are doing things in the service, simply because other than to let them know what passage I'm using or speaking on. Because I want to see what God leads other people to do. Especially like in this week. I was led, as I was preparing this week, to begin by reading a passage that we're not going to look at, but I just wanted us to hear it, to listen to these words from Isaiah. So, like the opening passage we heard this morning from Isaiah, listen to these words from Isaiah chapter 60. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples. But the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. So I think that's fitting for what we will be considering this morning. So if you have a Bible with you and you wish to turn there, turn to John chapter 2. Chances are you won't have the same version as what I have up here, because I use this one specifically for a single phrase in the whole passage. And so this is the New Revised Standard Version. And the passage that they translate into English is, according to most people that I read this last week, the best that we can do in English. So, let's read together, or follow along as I read. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the stewards called the bridegroom. And he said to them, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So I want to give you a couple of spoiler alerts. This passage is not about wine. This passage is not about the interaction between Jesus and his mother. This passage really is about Jesus being revealed. And not only that, I find it interesting that when we look at all the signs together, there is a part that we get to play in that we are invited to participate in the display of Jesus' glory. But we don't bring anything to the table other than following and doing very specific things, but very ordinary things. Very ordinary activities that are planned there and put there for us by God, and in this case in particular by Jesus. And through those actions, then he works the miraculous. I thought it was just amazing. It was so, that's why I'm not sure whether the title slide is still up there. But there are so many different things happening here. And if you see the subtitle, which I can't read because of the glare of the lights, it is, and I didn't put it in my notes, quite frankly. Oh, there it is. Yes. The miraculous in plain sight. Now, for those of you who are English majors, that is not a mistake. I'm doing exactly what the writer of this gospel does quite a bit. I'm using a word that can be ambiguous, especially in terms of its sound, both in terms of us being able to see, but also what I want to emphasize is the location in which it happens. Okay? And for us, the application for us, the location that we are in right now, right here, living in this community. So let's start. There are 7 miraculous signs that John records. 3 of them are found in the other Gospels as well. 3 of them are very similar or have, analogous occurrences in the other Gospels, but only this one sign, turning water into wine, is unique to John. No one else mentions it. But what happens with many things, and I don't know whether you've noticed this, but oftentimes when I go to focus on a specific passage, I find that way more questions come up than I find answers. Now, I do find some answers, but I find that there are way more questions. Also, the other thing I find is that biblical stories, biblical narrative in particular, breaks all the rules that we were taught in school. You introduce the characters, you introduce some sort of struggle or problem that has to be solved, and then someone comes up and figures out a way to solve that problem, and everything is resolved, right? There is no resolution in this story. It's as though somebody, like Steve threatens to do to me, turned off the mic, right? And shut it down. So let's look at this, because it has many tightly packed and precisely crafted pieces in it that are woven together both in this story and throughout the whole book. But I'm going to loosely follow the order of it. So we're going to look at on the 3rd day, you noticed. Right? On the 3rd day, there was a wedding. So you think to yourself, and I don't know about you, but I've been taught this way, well, what does he mean? Like, what happened in the previous 3 days? So if you turn to John chapter 1, you'll find this simple phrase that is repeated 3 times. The next day. Gee, I'm sure that's just a coincidence that this story starts with on the 3rd day, and previously in John chapter 1, it repeats this phrase, the next day. So, but look at what happens. Look at the content in those days. In the next days, if you look at verses 29, 35, and 43, that the phrase introduces something. The first time, it is John the Baptist who sees Jesus, and he declares about Jesus, look, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. Okay? What is he doing there? What is he saying? He is saying something about who Jesus is, and he's saying something about what Jesus does, or is going to do, right? His person and his purpose, we could say. You drop down to verse 35, and the next day, John was there again, and 2 of his disciples were with him. And again, he says the same thing. Look, the Lamb of God. And so they, meaning the two disciples of John, begin to follow Jesus. So there's an interaction between them. Jesus says, what are you looking for, or what do you want? And they tell him, we want to know where you're staying. And Jesus says, come and you will see. It's an invitation, right? It's a simple invitation to these two disciples. And notice that the response doesn't need a verbal response. They can respond positively simply by doing what? Following him, walking, an ordinary activity that all of us do every day if we're healthy. Okay? So, finally, the following day, Jesus, now notice the difference here. Jesus goes and he finds Philip. And he commands Philip. This is in the imperative. Follow me. And what does Philip do? He obeys, right? But what's the next thing that Philip does? He goes and finds a friend of his, Nathanael. Now, Nathanael is going to be an important character here when I talk about themes that are woven through, but they're very subtle sometimes. So he finds Nathanael, and what does he say to Nathanael? Come and see, right? An invitation. A simple thing that we can all do. An activity we can engage in. So as a follower of Jesus, he invites his friend to follow Jesus. Now, when you follow down to the end of chapter 1, it's the encounter between Jesus and Nathanael that is really, I would say at this point in the gospel, very dramatic. Because there's the discussion is, how does Jesus know Nathanael? And he explains all that. And Nathanael makes these declarations about Jesus, that he is the king, that he's the chosen one, things like that. And look at what Jesus responds. Very truly, I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. That statement. Please, if you want to become a student of the Bible, track these two references down. If you have a pen, you can write them down. Genesis chapter 28. The ascending and descending comes from where Jacob goes to sleep after he flees from his brothers so he's not going to be murdered. And he has this vision where he sees a stairway from where he's sleeping up into heaven, and he can see the angels ascending and descending to God. And he declares that this is the house of God. This is the entrance to the place where God dwells. Right? And then, mashed together with that reference in Daniel chapter 7, where you read about the description about the one who looks like a son of man, entering into the throne of the Ancient of Days. This is not just sort of Jesus saying, I'm here to help fix things. This is Jesus declaring that I am the one who made it, and I have come to fulfill the purposes that I have for the whole world. So Jesus declares this transcendent scope of his mission, but he doesn't tell the disciples, or anyone else for that matter, of all the details, because the details that they have in their mind are not the details that he knows are going to be fulfilled. And he has to, condition them, or slowly clue them in as to what is really going to go on. So, now, we're back at the wedding of Cana in Galilee. This location is very important. Mentions Cana of Galilee, or Cana in Galilee, depending on your translation, is mentioned 4 times in the Gospel of John. Twice here. Notice very clearly that this location opens this story and it closes the story. Right? So, it then is mentioned again in another sign, in the very next sign that happens, where the royal official from Capernaum, who has a son who is, in his words, dying. He knows this child of mine is going to die. And he's heard that Jesus is in Cana of Galilee. So he walks from Capernaum, about 11 kilometers, so that he can see Jesus and ask him to come and heal his son. And then finally, it is in John chapter 21 where who appears again but Nathanael. And we're told that Cana is his hometown. Now, we'll come back to that. But in all three scenes, these conditions or these ideas pop up in different settings. The first is that there is a need that cannot be met by human effort. Right? In our passage, there is no more wine. And I'm not particularly adept at winemaking. I have never done it, but I hear it takes quite a long time. I would say from planting to bottle at least a year, and then, according to the reading I've done, maybe you might get a passable table wine. But you're not going to get a fine, or as is described here, the best wine. That will take years. But they've run out, and they have none. So there's no way they're going to be able to produce or supply what they need. So that's one. A need that is beyond human effort to supply. Next is that Jesus invites people to participate in all of these things. And he invites them either to bring something or simply to do a simple activity. So in the case of the official that comes to Jesus with the sick son, Jesus just tells him, go, your son is going to live. And he immediately takes Jesus at his word and just does it. He does not ask for any sign. He does not ask for any verification. He is walking down to Capernaum. As he's walking down, his servants, who know that his son has all of a sudden become well, they are walking toward him, and they are the ones that give him the verification after the fact, after he has obeyed what Jesus just told him. Now, chapter 21 is very interesting because I think John is using these to tell us the whole book holds together and is focused upon the one character, Jesus. In fact, if you think about it, when I read this, who is the only person who is named in this whole story? It's Jesus, right? And who are the guests? Now, be careful. Who are the guests that are identified? The mother of Jesus, right? And by inference, we can say the disciples of Jesus. So Jesus is the only one named. The only guests that are identified have a direct connection to Jesus. Who do you think this story is about? There's only one right answer. But it won't be on the test. Don't worry. It's Jesus. And I think by the way John uses the location of Cana in Galilee, he's saying this whole book is about Jesus. Because what happens there in Cana? And look at the pattern again. If you want, turn to John chapter 21, beginning in verse 2. We have a list of the disciples who are present. Remember, this is again the number 3, the third time that Jesus has appeared to his disciples after his resurrection. Right? Peter has said, and it's the in-between time between his resurrection and the day of Pentecost, Peter says, look, I'm going to go fishing. And Nathanael from Cana is listed as one of those disciples that was present. They go fishing all night, and what do they catch? They were skilled like me in fishing. Nothing. They caught zip. And so they come to the shore, and before they even hit the shore, Jesus calls out to them and says, friends, Have you not caught anything? That doesn't come across in our English translations. But he's asking them a question with the implication that they're going to give him a negative answer. And they say, no, we haven't. And Jesus says, well, cast your net on the other side. A simple, ordinary activity. And they do. And they catch so many fish that they cannot pull the net out of the water. And that's when Jesus is identified, and the rest of the story. But when the disciples get in, what do they see on the shore? Jesus already has a bed of coals, bread, and fish. But what does he say to Peter? He says, you know what? Bring some of the fish that you have. Jesus invites him to participate with him. And yet, he has already provided for them. Right? And I think that's the call we need to hear today. Where is Jesus asking us to participate with him, to join him? Because he wants to make space for us to do that. Now, we'll do it in different ways, at different times. The way we will be able to do that is different for each of us. But without exception, we can all do the very simple tasks that we see in these signs. So, they have no wine. I know, the thing you've been waiting for all day, right? With these words, Mary describes the situation facing the bridal couple's family. They are facing certain, get this, in their culture, they're facing certain severe public humiliation, at least. Okay? Because of this lack of wine. So it's not about the fact that they don't have wine. It's not like Mary saying to Jesus, have on somebody else. She's concerned about the honor of this family, that it will be stained because of this. But she doesn't ask Jesus. Notice, it's not a request for Jesus to do anything. But it is, interestingly enough, it is about the quality and the quantity of the wine, because that is a sign of messianic blessing. You can read it in many places. One of the ones I appreciate the best is Joel chapter 2, but you can also read it out of Isaiah chapter 25. And it talks there in these passages and in others that I didn't put down. And I always say this to myself, and this must be a broken record for some of you who have heard me speak more than once. I didn't put this in my notes, and I should have. It talks about the mountains and the valleys dripping with wine as a sign that God has come to bless his people with abundance. So, but look at Jesus' reply. Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come. Now that phrase is why I chose this particular translation. What concern is that to you and to me? Now, it's an interesting response. Because in this, I don't see a rebuke of Mary. I see a question concerning roles and responsibilities. What is my role in this? What is your role in this? Now, without saying so, look at the response of Mary. What does that tell you? Mary just turns and says to the servants, whatever he tells you to do, you do that. So she doesn't tell them he's going to do anything. She doesn't tell them what to do other than to wait. Now, I'm sure if you are like me, I have done more than enough waiting, at least from my perspective, to hear from God and to seek direction from God than I have liked. Have I benefited from it? For sure. Have I been learned a lot from it? Yes. Have I eventually received answers? Most of the time. But some of the time, no. I think I'm beginning to clue into the fact that maybe the waiting is the point. Right? But she tells them to wait. Jesus, notice, he does not, remember that? He does not act directly. when he does this miracle, it is not that he gets up and does something or says something, but he acts through the ordinary actions that you would see servants engaging in at a wedding. Right? He calls them over and he tells them, fill those stone water jars with water. And they do so. So then he says, now go over, and what I would think maybe a more apt word to use would be to ladle out some into a serving vessel, if not the specific drinking vessel, and then take that to the chief steward, or what we would call maybe the head waiter. And so they do that. Those simple actions, filling, drawing out, and serving. Right? And they do it. Now, at some point in that sequence, that water turns into wine. Now, if it had been in between the water jar and the vessel that they drew it out into, Jeannie was commenting to her, because she has to listen to these messages about 3 or 4 times before I get here. She said to me, would you have stuck your finger in it and tasted it? And I said, yeah, because it's their job that's on the line, right? They're taking it up to the steward and say, here, taste this. Anyway, so Jesus did not act directly, and the servants follow his direction. But also notice what he says. We want to come back to Jesus' declaration, my hour has not yet come. Again, something that you need to think about. That we need to, what does this really mean? It's not a refusal to act. But I think in light of Jesus' ministry, it is a declaration that he is going to put a limit on the extent of revelation that we will see from this sign. Because I want to ask you a question. Maybe you're not as familiar, maybe you don't remember from our reading, but how many people do you think were even aware, that this sign had taken place? Okay? Just the servants? Okay. Maybe Mary? Jesus, obviously. But how few? Relative to the crowd. Because remember, this isn't like, it's funny, I looked up images. So I typed, if you Google wedding at Cana, and then in Google, and you click on the images part, you will come up with all these paintings. Now, one thing about painting, I enjoy them to a certain limit. But what stuns me more is how the painting reveals more about when the painter lived than it ever does about the scene that you read about in the Bible, right? There are all these buildings, and they have columns and archways, and, the place is packed. And it looks like in the picture you couldn't step somewhere without hitting somebody. But this is a town, probably more like even a small village. It wasn't even connected to the main roads at this time in Jesus' life. It wasn't connected to them until well after Jesus' life. And it was up in the hills. So it would have been, I don't know, maybe a crowd of 50, maybe a crowd even this small, But very few people knew that he had done this. And he has limited, by even just the location, the extent of his glory that's going to be revealed. But he knows that this is not the end. He has to very carefully shape the expectations of his followers. So, and quite frankly, depending on the degree of inference we wish to apply to the words of the chief steward, that, usually everybody serves the best wine they've got at first, because after a couple of glasses, nobody's going to know the difference anyway. So, we might say that many of the guests' faculties were impaired, and I'm talking beyond the legal limit, and they would not have had the capacity to appreciate the quality of the wine, let alone to perceive what the real the unseen spiritual reality that it was pointing to. Let's put it that way. Okay, so we have a common pattern, a need that cannot be satisfied by human effort, a response of willingness to participate with or to obey simple directions, followed by an active commitment to follow Jesus. So we come back to our passage and we read what? That this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, Jesus did this and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So I want to look at that pattern and take a look, just briefly, at the linkage that John presents between signs and geographic locations. Now, why I do this is because, I don't know about you, but for me, in reading the Gospel of John, I have always approached it as the quote-unquote more spiritually oriented gospel. I don't know if any of you have been taught that or have assumed that or heard that it's more of almost like an ethereal, otherworldly gospel than than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm beginning to believe that's not the case. And this is one clear reason why. There is astoundingly, all of the signs that Jesus does are located specifically. And in some cases, there is an astounding amount of detail given. Okay? So let's quickly run through it. So no need to spend much time on the wedding at Cana, except to say that the participation of Mary to recognize the need of the people involved, the servants' willingness to fill, draw out, and serve. We've talked about that. Now, contrast that, because these are the first two signs, both are identified as happening in Cana, okay, with the royal official from Capernaum. He recognizes he has a desperate need, that his son is dying. And he goes and he says, he's very differential in asking Jesus to come. Because Jesus has just rebuked the crowd that is with him by saying that they are always looking for signs. You go, that's interesting, because the first sign has just happened in Cana of Galilee. But you have to remember that between Cana of Galilee and the Capernaum official is a trip. And it forms a little block in the Gospel of John. Jesus leaves Capernaum, immediately travels down to Jerusalem, where John even tells us that he performed signs plural, among the people. And then they're coming back. And he's come back to Cana, and this official is going to find him. So he rebukes the people, and it tells us in the original languages that when he says, you are always looking for signs, that you is a plural. But when he talks to the official, he talks in the singular, and he says, go, your singular, your son will live. So the official moves on. I got to move quicker here. I think. Can't read the thing. Anyway, so the response immediately compliant with, and his son is healed. Third, think of the man, and this is where the detail begins to really get crazy. The man who is an invalid and has been an invalid for 38 years. Okay? He's located in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, beside a pool with the Aramaic name of Bethesda, and it has 5 covered colonnades. Okay, there are 5 specifics of where this place is geographically located. And just to read a small quote from the Biblical Archaeology Society, when Jesus heals the paralytic in the Gospel of John, the Bethesda pool is described as having 5 porticos, a puzzling feature suggesting an unusual 5-sided pool, which most scholars dismissed as an unhistorical literary creation. Yet when this site was excavated, it revealed a rectangular pool with 2 basins separated by a wall, thus a 5-sided pool, and each side had a portico. That's dated from February 18th, 2025. Right? You talk about a specific location. Jesus wants to know. I mean, quite frankly, just come into my head, you think about it back in chapter 1. This is the one gospel that uses a term that Paul uses very frequently, but in a much different context. We are told in John chapter 1 that what? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, lived among us. So, I'll move on. But look at the invalid. Look at the pattern. What did the invalid lack? He lacked either muscle strength or muscle development for 38 years. And what does Jesus do? Jesus just tells him, get up and take your mat and go home. What does he do? At least in his head, he must have made the willing effort to say, I'm going to stand up. And he does. And he picks up his mat and he goes home. It's amazing, right? He didn't bring any of the power to his healing. All he did was a simple act. So the feeding of the 5,000, again, this is, it's not as much detail as that one. That's I think, the one that astounded me the most. But the feeding of the 5,000 above the Sea of Galilee, and it's also named in John as the Sea of Tiberias. Okay? So both a Gentile name and the Jewish name are included here. Okay? Very specific. And it came to be known as the Sea of Tiberias well after Jesus' death, but it only became that because Herod, the king of that area, had built a brand new town that he had completed in about 20 AD, so a little bit before Jesus began his earthly ministry. You talk about tying a location to a specific place at a specific time. John does that right here. So what do we see? We see the disciples and a large 5,000 people. And Jesus asks them to test them. What are we going to feed them? And so they give them all the responses. And one of them shows up with a small boy, and you know the story. He has 5 loaves and 2 fish. And so what does Jesus ask them? He invites them to participate how? Get them all to sit down on the grass. Okay? He blesses the bread, he breaks it, and they're all served, all 5,000. And then he gets them to gather up the leftovers. Now, if that didn't reveal his glory, and if they didn't make the connection between him and Moses, which the people did, then they were pretty slow. Now, I consider myself a relatively slow learner. As a friend of mine once told me, I'm very quick at grasping the obvious. So, all they had to do was just to follow simple instructions. The man born blind, actually an observation that Wes just told me this morning that I had never thought of before, was that and I said, I'd have to really think about it and look at it, but the only miracle we have where Jesus approaches, about the only thing I can think of Jesus approaching somebody is Zacchaeus, but he didn't work a visible miracle, but he did work a miracle in his life in terms of him, Zacchaeus, realizing who Jesus was. But other than that, here, Jesus observes a blind man, right? This is chapter 9. And so, what's the need? Well, it's obvious. It's not even stated in the text. If you read the narrative, you know what the man needs. I find in the Gospels there is a healing like this, where Jesus says, what do you want? And the blind man says, well, I want to see. Right? It's obvious. But look at the response that the blind man is called into. And again, the location. So he receives what I think we could reasonably say is a mud facial, and he's told to go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which when you look at the layout of Jerusalem is almost across the whole town from him. So this blind man is not going on an easy journey, right? He has to walk across town to this pool. So he does, washes, and he receives his sight. You know, did he contribute something to that miracle? Well, yeah, he did. But he didn't contribute any power. He just contributed a willingness to follow Jesus' instructions. Right? And then finally, there's the raising of Lazarus. And again, at a village in Bethany, specifically, close to Jerusalem, because there is, if you remember, Bethany that is across the Jordan where John the Baptist was baptizing. That's quite a distance from Jerusalem. But this one, it's the village of Bethany, and he goes on to say specifically that this is the place where he and his sisters, Mary and Martha, were from, and that many people from Jerusalem were also there. And so what does Jesus do? He talks to them. He tells Mary, that Lazarus is going to rise. And she, in faith, says, yes, Lord, I believe that he will rise on the judgment day. On that day. So what are they called to do? They take him to the tomb, to where the tomb is, to where he's been buried, and they roll away the gravestone. And that's their act of participation, and Jesus calls Lazarus out. Now, what do all of these things, what's the significance of all these things? I'm going to read two quotes to you. These ones really hit me. In them, that is, in these signs, Jesus exposes facet after facet of human need, showing at one and the same time man's inadequacy and Jesus or his all-sufficiency. All-sufficiency to provide abundance. And even in a greater scope, that would be sort of the immediate scope. In a greater scope, this, the first sign, had the same purpose that all the subsequent signs will have, namely, revelation about the person of Jesus. The primary focus is on Jesus as the one sent by the Father to bring salvation to the world. Our participation with Jesus, the one thing it does do is it provides us, in all cases, with a vantage point where we can clearly perceive who Jesus is, and we can, experience, if not personally, the abundance and the supply of God. We can see it supplied in someone else's life. So finally, how does Jesus want his followers to understand glory? Because throughout the book of John, John links these three ideas. Hour, which is mentioned here, my hour has not yet come. Glory, which is mentioned here, that is what is being revealed through these signs. What he doesn't mention here is death. That is the way, that is the pinnacle of Jesus revealing his glory. That's what it says in John. We read this in John chapter 12. Jesus replied, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." Remember how Jesus was identified by Nathanael right at the beginning in John chapter 1. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Now my soul, Jesus says, is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No. It was for this very reason I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven. I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. One of the commentators I wrote is a gentleman named Leon Morris, and he writes this about the meaning of Jesus' hour. In referring to his hour, there is no doubt that Jesus is referring to his death, but he speaks not of tragedy, but of triumph. He is not to be dishonored, he is to be glorified, and that by way of the cross. So lastly of all, in my, I did say finally a little bit earlier, I'm picking up bad habits from Brent. But I want to read this passage from John chapter 17. In John 17:1, and remember this is Jesus' prayer before he is going to go to be crucified, on the evening, really, that he is arrested. And it is more of a prayer, I think, of encouragement and of strengthening for us as believers. But he prays this in the first 3 verses. Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. Notice that. The connection between glory and his death. He knows what's going to happen. For you granted him authority over all people that he might give eternal life to those you have given him. Now this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. The life and abundance and power of God were made visible in specific locations at specific times by Jesus through his signs. Now, this eternal life is open to us if we simply, in ordinary ways, follow Jesus, his teachings, and the example he gave by the power of his Spirit. What do? We recognize our need and express our need to God. We seek and wait for his direction. We believe and follow him.